My Instagram story strategy has completely changed over the past few years. So I want to bring you inside my strategy, share what's working for me, and also share a little behind the scenes on how I actually create my stories. I truly think that if Instagram is one of your main social media platforms, then stories should be a non-negotiable in your strategy. When I like to think of stories in your Instagram strategy, they are truly the best way to connect with your existing audience and followers. And it also supports your other Instagram content. You probably notice if you reply to or like someone's Instagram story, you're a lot more likely to see their reels and other types of content in your feed. But the reason why I prioritize stories in my content is I find they are my top converting type of content that I create on Instagram, whether it's through the link sticker or leads replying to my story that they're ready to work with me. Chances are if you've been on Instagram for the past few years, you've noticed that stories has changed a lot. And maybe you've noticed a drop in just views, engagement, retention, like all across the board. But more recently, I've actually seen those numbers go up for me with the changes that I've made in my strategy that I'm going to get into in just a little bit. If I'm being honest, in 2020, when my audience really started to grow on Instagram, I would get thousands of story views. And now that is like a high day with my story views. So in general, if you find that your story views are just lower than they used to be, that is kind of across the board normal, but there are definitely ways to improve your story views. It's really important that we first talk about what just is no longer working on stories and honestly what has not been for a while. The first is posting a ton of story slides where it's literally like an ant trail that people have to tap through a million times to get to the end of. People just aren't gonna watch that many stories. Another big shift is I feel like talking head videos used to be like the main way people created stories and like these little mini trainings. I just find that is not the case anymore. I think that can still be a part of your stories, but it should be like the 10%, not the 90% of the content you post. And definitely not talking head videos that are super random, super rambly, the hey guys, the I'm just popping in. It doesn't work anymore. It never really worked, honestly. Or my personal pet peeve is when your stories don't have anything on them. No closed captions, no text for context of what you're actually talking about. So many people are watching stories without the sound on, but also people just are skimming through things. So you have to give them a reason to even watch that talking video. Another thing that I feel like was so trendy was just like sharing your to-do list for the day. And that just doesn't work in the same way it used to. What really blew up in 2020 was resharing tons of content, and not just your own content, but other people's content. And while I do think there's a time and place for resharing your reels or other types of content to your stories, just like dropping and resharing anything you like, anything you post on your stories is not an effective strategy. A big shift I personally made is when I'm doing launches or promotions, I am not leaning into graphic, heavy, really designed story slides, which I feel like really used to work for launches and promotions, but kind of the stories that I'm designing now, they essentially have the same content, but they're just a little bit more organic feeling. And kind of a common theme you'll see with my own strategy that's working right now is that you just don't want to use stories as the place to randomly post anything. It's not a dumping ground for random slides that you actually aren't thinking through like you're thinking through the rest of your content. And most importantly, stories should not be the only part of your Instagram strategy. Stories are really great for engaging with your current audience, which means they are not growth and reach content for reaching new people. So if you're only doing stories, you are really scratching the surface of really the results that you can see with a platform like Instagram. And if you can create an Instagram story, you can create a reel, you can create a carousel. They're really not that different. Just because they're expiring doesn't mean they're any less important than other types of content. So that leads me to what is working in my current Instagram story strategy. The first is more personal connection content. I always like to recommend having a personal content pillar in any content strategy because people want to connect with people on social media. And oftentimes I find this personal content pillar really shows up on stories. So when I look at the content that gets the most replies, the most views, the most engagement, It has nothing to do with video content. It has everything to do with my matcha, doing like garden updates, like people eat that up. Sharing my outfits, especially when I'm traveling or doing speaking things, or even kind of behind the scenes when I'm actually traveling for work. I find that two types of things really work well on stories. The really boring content, like the mundane things that are happening every day that seem so boring and that people wouldn't care about, but people really do. It's like that comforting content. Or we have the novelty side of things. So that's why whenever I'm traveling, I notice a huge uptick on people being interested because I don't always travel. And so it's really interesting to watch. And the other type of content that I find do really well that I've kind of like gotten a perfect flow with is what I like to call strategic behind the scenes. So you're bringing people behind the scenes into a process, a client project, like something you're actively working on in your business. And then you're tying it into something strategic. So maybe it's a promotion, maybe it's an offer. I have always done this for when I'm doing like a video content day in person, and I always get so many people that are ready to book another one. It's because essentially you're incorporating social proof while actually showing what you do and actually like keeping it top of mind and creating that offer awareness. The other thing I've really strike the balance of is creating really great promotional slides when I'm sharing things like my YouTube videos, for example. I don't just say, hey, here's a new video, come watch it. I really bring people along so they're interested and actually want to leave their very comfortable seat on Instagram and go over to whatever call to action that I have. And we'll kind of get into this a little bit more with the rest of the things in my story strategy. The biggest shift I've made is the visuals. So there's a few things that I've really seen work. The first thing is stories that are a lot more static and photos, and videos not being the main part of stories. So I like to do rarely talking head, basically no graphics when I'm building out my story slides, but I'll have videos sprinkled throughout, but it's mainly just like photos with very, very minimal text. I don't have huge text sections of a bunch of paragraphs of text for people to read through. I actually like to spread out my text if I'm sharing a lot into multiple slides, so people are really engaged and wanting to watch each slide of the story. One of my favorite tips for people wanting to create more videos is to capture what I like to call stock content. So video clips that are on brand for you. Maybe it's behind the scenes in your day. Maybe it's something that you shoot kind of in bulk and you have a shot list for. But essentially, you want to do that same thing for your stories. So not only will I use those stock content video clips, I also do the same thing but for photos. So in my stock content album, in my camera roll, I have pictures of me working. I have pictures of me walking around, of traveling, of my outfits, of my matcha. Like I have tons of different photos, and I actually reuse those often because they're kind of like core brand images for me. And I kind of like to use them together when it kind of makes sense. So when I may be sharing a few clips of like a beachy moment when I was in Mexico, I'll consistently use that type of imagery. Same thing where I just went to New York recently, I captured lots of photos. And so I'll kind of use similar vibe images for my story slides. So I am rarely creating my stories in real time. I think this is a huge mistake that people make. Not only are they posting very unintentionally and very unstrategically, but that is like very exhausting. So whenever I'm traveling, whenever I'm doing things, I'm rarely like capturing something and posting it in real time. I'm like organizing and saving those assets to share cohesively later on. The last thing when it comes to visuals is I love using those interactive stickers, but I like to use them very intentionally where it actually makes sense to have it. So I like to use polls when there's actually like a question or a conversation involved where I want to kind of see where people are at and get them a part of the conversation. I do like to use question stickers, but I like to be very specific on the question or the ask that I actually have, so it makes it really easy to engage with. And if you feel like you're getting low engagement on these types of interaction stickers, you just need to be specific, you need to make it relevant to the story that you're sharing, and you need to do it more consistently. It's actually one of my favorite things to do with one of like the first slides of my stories. It really gets that interaction and engagement within that first story slide. So it tends to increase retention for people watching, but it also really encourages Instagram to show more people my stories. And of course, I love the link sticker. Naturally, it will decrease your views, but if you're getting conversions and sales, views aren't necessarily the main objective if it's reaching your warmest audience. So a few things that I like to do, definitely update the preview text so it's a very specific call to action. So if I'm sharing my workshop, I want to say, get your ticket for the workshop. I also like to sometimes include a link sticker multiple times. So I don't just share it once and then dip out. I like to share it a few times so people actually are encouraged to take action. I often find that second or third time that I'm sharing a link sticker is when that tends to get the most clicks. Okay, the thing that I know everyone wants to know is there a perfect amount of story slides? And so I find that there's a little bit of a sliding scale here, and so I'm gonna share the 3 ways that I like to approach this. But essentially how I want you to think about it is the more slides that you're posting, and this is like individual stories, this is more so reaching your warmest, most engaged community. So naturally your views are going to go down. The less slides that you post, which literally could be just you posting one story slide, you are more likely to get more views, more reach to more of your audience. If I'm posting 5 story slides versus posting 1 story slide, I've literally seen my story views like 10x. But you have to understand, having less views doesn't mean your stories aren't working, in my opinion, if they're still getting replies, link clicks, and people actually liking and interacting with them. So the first thing you can do is just have 1 story slide. And really this is where you want to share something very specific. You don't want to overstuff it. You want to make sure the visuals are strong. I find that the strongest visuals is often like you being in your content. And this can be with or without a link sticker. The next one, which I kind of find is the sweet spot, is 2 to 3 slides. It's enough slides that you're able to share more, really bring people along for your stories and keep people engaged, but there's not so many things for people to consume that they don't make it the entire way through. So this is where maybe on that first slide, you're getting people interested, you're hooking them in, you're sharing an idea or kind of what the story is gonna be about. And then the next slide or 2 is really just building on that and maybe ending with a call to action, for example. And if you're really wanting to like build out your stories, you have a lot of exciting things to share, don't feel like you have to limit yourself. I find that 5 to 12 story slides is like the absolute maximum that I would go, keeping in mind this really is for your ride or die most engaged community members. I feel like there's a huge myth and conversation around, should your stories expire? What should that look like? How many stories should you post within 24 hours? And this is what I've seen work the best. When I'm posting my story slides, I like to think of them cohesively as multiple slides kind of going together to tell a story. So I actually like to post all of those story slides at once for one story sequence that I'm sharing. So people can binge the entire thing, engage, and get the entire story that you're trying to share. Then from there, I either like it to expire before I post my next stories. I sometimes will do what I like to call a bump slide. So I'll maybe post another story slide or 2 that's kind of related to the first set of stories that I posted, just to kind of get people re-engaged, maybe remind them of what I was talking about, maybe share some social proof or a little reminder, or even some like comments or interactions that I'm having around those initial story slides, kind of like a way to re-engage and get even more people seeing those initial stories or staying along for the rest of them. At the very most, I would create 1 set of story slides maybe in the morning, and then another set of story slides in the evening, and then I would let those expire for 24 hours. I don't overthink this. I don't think this is something to obsess over, but I do think it's a good rule of thumb to make sure that people have everything they can binge for your stories all at once, and you're kind of waiting until some of that stuff is gone so people aren't joining your fresh stories in between your old stories that are kind of expiring. So that's really why I think that is something to consider in your story strategy. And if you leave with anything from this video, your stories need to tell a story, which I feel like is kind of the summary of everything that we've talked about. So essentially, I like to think about my stories just like other pieces of content and outline the flow of what I'm actually going to be sharing. I'm not just sporadically posting whatever I want with random ideas and random updates and random behind the scenes. I am bringing people through an actual story flow and using stories as stories. Such a concept. And as you're getting into practice of this, you definitely could outline your stories. I promise you, this will make it so much easier to create them. But once you get used to this, you'll kind of like outline them in your head as you're building them of like, okay, how do I want to start this to really get people engaged, hook them in? How do I want to bring them through the story? Really build on what I'm sharing, like really share more information. And how do I want to wrap things up? Put like a bow at the end of your story so it feels complete. People know what that next step is. Maybe they're engaging, and that is a complete story flow. So whether I'm just sharing some more personal content, or if I'm outlining something to actually promote a workshop or a YouTube video, or if I'm even building out slides for a brand partnership where there are sponsored story slides that I'm going to be sharing. All of those things I want to go through a story flow to really keep people engaged and interested. So that essentially is the overview of what has changed for me in my story strategy. So more personal content, more static story slides with minimal text for the visuals, intentionally using interactive stickers, posting only a few story slides and how to actually post them, when to let them expire, and most importantly, having a very clear story flow. I'd love to hear what you found the most helpful that you're excited to use in your own story strategy in the comments. And I feel like it could be really fun to actually break down a few of the story slides that I've actually posted that I found that have gotten the most engagement and results a little bit deeper, so you can actually see these strategies in real time. So definitely let me know if you'd love to see a video on that. And if you need help organizing your stock content for posting to stories, I highly recommend watching this episode of my Simple Video System series. And I'll see you in my next video.